Welcome, everyone. Thanks so much for attending today's webinar. We hope you, your families, and your organizations are coping well under these circumstances. I'm Cathy Jordan. I'm the Consulting Research Director for the Children in Nature Network. I'm also a faculty member in the Department of Pediatrics at the University of Minnesota and the Associate Director for Leadership and Education at the university's Institute on the Environment. I'm joining you from my home office in Minneapolis, which is located on the unceded territory of the Dakota people, meaning that this is land that is both traditional and ancestral, as well as contemporary for this sovereign nation. This is the second webinar in our Finding Nature series, building on a conversation last month between CNNN's Executive Director Sarah Milligan Toffler and co-founder Rich Louv. In my welcome, I stated that I hoped you were all coping well given the circumstances. And today's theme is very much in that vein. Our daily lives, family lives, and the ways in which we're doing our work have been unimaginably altered. Today's discussion is about how those disruptions affect children and what we can do to promote resilience in children during this crisis and beyond. This pandemic and its various ripple effects could be stressful to children in a variety of ways. There have been abrupt changes in routine. Now those changes in routine need to be sustained. This is a new normal. It's a marathon, not a sprint. The kids are likely to be more socially isolated from friends, extended family, teachers. They're probably spending more time in front of screens. They may be less physically active. Parents may also be stressed for these same reasons, but also, as adults, there could be work-related stress, possibly loss of employment causing financial strain. The dynamics between parents and kids may be strained, and that could be leading to some domestic violence. And of course, some families may be experiencing COVID-related illness or even death. It's important to understand how these stressors may be affecting children's health and well-being right now and in the long term, and what factors in their lives could serve to buffer that stress and build their resilience, including the important role that nature can play in that process. This pandemic has laid bare myriad disparities and inequities in access to nature. So how can we leverage this increased understanding of the essentialness of nature right now, as well as the heightened realization of inequities as a result of the crisis, to build a system or infrastructure that supports equal access to nature for health and well-being for all communities now and into the future? Coming together with colleagues and friends to better understand the issues, share ideas, and solve problems is one of the more constructive and hopeful things that we can do together. So I really thank you for being part of this discussion today. This is going to be a panel discussion format. We're going to start with some comments about adversity, stress, and child well-being by Megan Gunnar. Dr. Gunnar is a Regents and Distinguished McKnight Professor at the University of Minnesota and directs the university's Institute of Child Development. Megan's a renowned researcher who studies stress neurobiology and development. We'll follow that with some discussion by me about what we know about how nature can buffer stress in children and contribute to the development of resilience. In the last portion of the panel discussion, we'll discuss how systems need to think about nature as integral to their goals. You may have read back in our advertising and PR that we were to be joined by Dr. Hannah Hamdi today. Unfortunately, she can't join us today, but we're really pleased to welcome Kim Moore-Bailey. Kim is the CEO of Youth Outside. Youth Outside is a nonprofit providing grant making, capacity building, and training to promote healthy lives and inspire future champions of the planet, with an emphasis on equitable access to the positive benefits of meaningful outdoor experiences. We'll follow this panel discussion with audience Q&A. Please use the audience question icon at the top of your webinar page to post your questions for any of the three of us at any point during the webinar. We'll do our best to get to as many as we can, but there are literally hundreds of you on this webinar, and we might not be able to get to all of them. So we request your patience with that. I also want to make sure that you're aware of a new website we launched a few weeks ago. It's called findingnature.org. Over the past couple of months, we've been receiving a lot of questions and requests for information from partners and leaders in our network across many fields of work. And given this clear and urgent need for information and ideas, we launched findingnature.org to highlight some of the best resources and creative problem solving coming from trusted resources in our movement. We also hope it serves as a virtual gathering place or online meetings, events like this, until we can meet again in person. I'd like to encourage you to use hashtag Finding Nature to help aggregate all of the great ideas and resources that are being shared on social media right now. We'll be adding new resources to findingnature.org each week and ask you to share your ideas, your resources. Tell us what you want to see on the site as well. And you can communicate with us about this by sending us an email at info@childrenandnature.org. And so check back regularly at findingnature.org to see what's new. We're particularly looking for resources that address lack of equitable access to nature. We recognize that not everyone has access to a park or green space nearby. So we're also collecting, sharing information on how to connect to nature, even in indoors. So think about that as well. You all have lots of expertise and things to share with each other, and we encourage you to use the chat that is on the left side of your screen. Many of you are doing that right now as you're telling us where you're from. So when you want to share something with each other, talk to each other, use the chat. But please use the Q&A function at the top of your screen when you want to pose a question to one of the speakers. So let's get started with our panel discussion. I'm going to first pose the first question to Megan. So Megan, we're all worried about how the children are coping with this pandemic. What's the most critical factor in determining how children will do during this time? Megan, you're on mute.
I'm unmuted now. I'm glad you asked it in that way, because we can't really talk about children and their stress and how they may be coping without really starting out with families and how the family is doing, because in a very real sense, children are embedded in their families, and how they manage is reflected in how the family is managing. Now, that doesn't mean if the family is doing well, the child will have no issues. Certainly their children will be anxious, they'll be worried. But if the family is not doing well, if the parents are struggling with high anxiety, if the parents are in conflict with one another or other adults in the household, if the family feels fragile during this time, then we can be assured that the children will struggle. It's also a great time because families, parents should be beginning to take care of their own needs, to share with your children what you are doing, to deal with your own concerns and worries, to, especially in this context of this discussion, to talk to them about how you're using nature as a way to cope, how I'm going to take a walk, or let's take a walk so we can all relax, or isn't I've seen the beautiful tree greening outside my door and I'm taking just a few minutes to really appreciate that, and that is helping me feel well, because that kind of modeling can help children learn coping skills that can last a lifetime.
That's a really important point, Megan. At CNN, we're very much thinking about how children function in the context of their families and communities. We're working towards nature-based solutions that serve that whole family system. So talk to us a little bit about what this stress you're talking about is. We use that word all the time, but what do scientists mean by that word? And how do stressful things kind of like get under the skin to affect health and well-being?
Sure, important question. For scientists, stress is a response of systems in the body that evolved or were designed, whichever way you want to say it, to go into overdrive when we're threatened. These systems provide us with the energy that we need to overcome threat and to protect our bodies for the impact of damage. Now, if this sounds like a response to being chased by some wild animal or being in a fight, that's right, because these systems evolved to protect us when we are under those kinds of threats. However, we have come to be able to anticipate threat and to anticipate psychological threats that are equally important to our well-being. So we activate these systems in a big way if we are fearing that we're going to lose a job, if we're afraid that we're going to get evicted, if we're worried about paying our bills, if we're being socially rejected, if we are doing badly at school, or if we are fearful that powerful people are angry with us. And for children, that's a really big one. So we kick these big, powerful stress systems into gear, even though we don't really need them in those circumstances, because we don't really need to run away, but we kick them in Now, the systems we're talking about are, here comes some big words, the sympathetic adrenal medullary system, also known as the SAM system, which is a little friendlier. And that's the one that pumps out adrenaline. And we are familiar with that adrenaline dump when you get really scared. That is the key fight or flight system of the body. But the other system, and by the way, that one liberates energy by breaking down fat. The other system is called the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal cortical system, HPA for short, which is also easier to say. That produces cortisol. And this is a very powerful hormone that begins to break down muscle and meat after. So it's designed to come after the fat is somewhat used up. It gets into almost every tissue in the body, and it changes the way our genes function. And the brain is a major target of cortisol. This system is designed to sustain us after the initial fight-flight system. And the third system I want to talk about is the immune system, which maybe people don't think of as a stress system, but it is. The immune system will treat psychological threats as if we have been wounded or infected. And it will mount an increase in white blood cells that create a sort of mild inflammation. The inflammation actually sends some signals to the brain and triggers what we call sickness behavior. And we're all familiar with this sickness behavior: achy, tired, irritable, mildly depressed, just want to go to bed and sleep, which may be the way many folks are feeling right now. So there's a pattern to the stress response. You initially get the runaway and hide, runaway, fight, or hide. And then you use cortisol and other hormones, but especially to lay down a deep memory for what just happened so you can avoid it in the future. And then you kick in processes that might make you want to withdraw and rest and heal. And all of that, if it happens in one fell swoop and once, is actually good. But if it keeps happening over and over and over and over, you're in this chronic stress state, it can produce significant wear and tear on the body. So it's understandable.
So Megan, thank you. Is all of this happening in children?
Well, of course, it depends on how the parents are managing. But if the child is being threatened and stressed highly, then yes, those systems kick in for children as well. But parents are powerful social buffers of this stress system. Now, we've done studies where we have taken toddlers and shown them things that can produce mild fear, like having a live clown come into the room and say, "Hey, come over here." Nothing more terrifying to a child than a clown, right? Don't ever bring a clown to the kid's birthday party. If they are in a strong and trusting relationship with their parent, and if the parent is calm and supportive, we have found that the child does not produce any of these stress hormones that I'm talking about, even though they may be clinging to the parent and indicating, "I ain't going over to that clown, no matter how much you pay me." But if the relationship isn't trusting, and if the parent is either pushing the kid, dismissing the child's feelings by pushing them towards the clown, or is ignoring them, then the child activates their stress system because they don't have that parent buffering them. The parent remains this powerful stress buffer until the child is about halfway through pubertal development, at which point children certainly continue to use their parents, but their parent isn't really able to turn off their stress systems in the same kind of way. When they'll depend on their relationship with their parents, and so on. But the child actually is beginning to grow up. And this is what this is indicating, that the child's stress system is beginning to be unembedded with the parents, and they're happy to come to learn to cope with this on their own. Now, we've studied this mostly in situations where the child is afraid of being evaluated poorly by others. And, when you're a child, if your parent thinks you're wonderful, that's great. When you're in adolescence, it doesn't really matter whether your parent thinks, well, it does, but not as much. What really matters is how your peers and people outside the home treat you. So the parent is losing some of that power in adolescence.
So what about adolescents then and the social buffering? You said this doesn't really work for them.
Well, we know that that's not true when we're talking about social evaluative stressors. like getting up and giving a speech in front of an audience, or being socially rejected. There's a horrible game that they have adolescents play to look at how the brain responds to rejection, that where they're throwing a ball with two other players, and after a while the two other players start ignoring them and just throw the ball back and forth and so on. It doesn't, when those situations, no. What we don't know is when they're actually frightened about physical harm. And here I would be surprised, but we don't know for sure, that it isn't still helping to be with people that you know can take care of things better than you can. Hopefully those
Yeah.
are your parents.
Yeah, right. Thank you. So, what can we do for children now during these pandemic days that'll reduce this stress?
Step one, parents need to make sure they take care of themselves. I really can't emphasize that enough. I know so many parents that are running themselves ragged to try to make the world as perfectly and completely normal for their children. And I hear the panic in their voices, and I'm sure their children appreciate everything they're doing, but also hear the panic in their voices. So it's just like when we used to fly on airplanes and the cabin pressure dropped and the gas and the mask came down, and they would say, you know, please put the mask on yourself before helping others. Parents have to pay attention to how well they're doing and help keep them and their relationship strong. And if they do that, and then they can turn and put the mask on their child. And what that means is talking honestly with your children about what's going on, not flooding them with lots of information, but if they want to know, be honest. One trick there is, though, we often interpret our children's questions in light of the way we would be thinking if we asked that question. So many parents learn when a child asks you like some question to say, well, what are you thinking might happen? And get a little more information and actually address the actual question and not your question that turns into. That could be helpful. Um, be very reassuring. Things are scary, things are uncertain, but we are a family and we will get through this just fine. We're solid. If you can convey that, children will feel safe. Um, Empathize, but don't rush in with solutions. Be a good sounding board for their ideas, especially as they get older. Having a place to talk out your fears and worries without having somebody else freak out, right, is just really, really helpful. That's why we go to therapists, right? And being able to be a good sounding board, listen, get their ideas about what they should think they should do. If the idea isn't a wise one, don't immediately leap in and try to correct it. They probably know it's not wise. And if you just give them a little time, they'll say, well, actually, that's not a good idea, or maybe that really wouldn't happen. And what you're doing by doing that is helping them build confidence in their own ability to cope. And that's such a big issue for children, is to know that while you're there to be their protective backup with development, they are developing the skills and the capabilities to ultimately become those adolescents that can sort of leave you behind a bit and move out into the world and know that they can take care of themselves. And then do things as a family, strengthen family ties. Go out into nature. If you have a backyard, you know, play a game of tag even. Get out there and be together. And use this time as perhaps a time that will strengthen your family in a way that will really last for your child's lifetime.
Thanks, Megan. That was a really helpful stress biology 101. Thank you. I want to pick up on some of the ideas that you just mentioned, because this is also where spending time in nature, obviously, particularly as a family, as you mentioned, can be really helpful in coping with stresses for both the kids and the parents. I want to talk a little bit about what we know from research about that connection between nature and stress. We know from experimental studies, which are the most rigorous form of research designs, that nature contact reduces stress. When, for example, high school students were exposed to a social stressor in the school setting, and then they got to look out a window either onto greenery, they recovered from that stress, both in their perceptions of the stress as well as their physiological stress response. They recovered more quickly than those who could only look out on a parking lot or had no window to look out on. Studies that compare responses of people who are randomized to a nature walk or an urban walk, it's very common design, they almost always show that that nature walk is beneficial in some way. People report feeling more relaxed, they perform better on tests that are designed to be mentally fatiguing. Even their brain function, if you do brain scans, it looks healthier on those brain scans after the nature walk. Many of you have probably heard of the Park prescription or Park RX movement. In the context of that movement, some researchers in Oakland showed that for every increase per week in family visits to a park, these students, who were older elementary students, reported a significant increase in their perceptions of their own resilience. Now, a number of studies looking at nature play, nature-based education, or park visits have found outcomes related to more physical activity, better social connection, better problem solving. And these would be considered functions that contribute to developing coping or resilience. We might call them something like component functions or key ingredients. As Megan mentioned earlier, kids and parents' stress levels tend to go kind of hand in hand. When they do activities in nature together, both of their stress levels tend to come down by their own self-report, which seems to contribute to their feelings of resilience. And we also know from research that family bonds do tend to increase when families do spend time together in nature-based activities. So all of this research that I've talked about is about nature's benefit to individuals. And this research certainly helps us make the case that nature is critical for our health and our well-being. It gives us every reason to strongly recommend families spend as much time as they can in nature, right now minding social distance guidelines, of course. One really important phenomenon we're seeing in the research is the idea that nature's impact tends to be relatively more positive for people from more disadvantaged communities compared to people from more advantaged communities. This fancy word for that is called the ecogenic effect. Unfortunately, these families who are in disadvantaged communities tend to have less access to quality nature and green space as well. So we also need to shift our systems so that with respect to nature, green space, community level health and well-being, those systems are working together and particularly paying attention to folks from diverse backgrounds. And that's a great segue into your areas of interest, Kim. So I'm wondering if you could give us a little bit of the lay of the land. What do we know about who has access to quality nature, who experiences the benefits, and who doesn't? And what are some of the consequences of not having those benefits or that access?
Thank you, Kathy. As you said earlier, one really important phenomenon that we're seeing in the research is this idea that nature's impact tends to be relatively more positive for people from communities that are impacted by challenges compared to people from communities where there are more opportunities. And it is documented that these same families tend to have less access to quality nature and green space. So, in thinking about the COVID 19 crisis for a moment, from what I've seen, people around the world are really turning to nature for reprieve and for respite, and from the stress and the uncertainty caused by the pandemic. And we know this is for children, for families, for adults. And as we've been discussing, the research is suggesting that improving equity to access to these green spaces might really help combat this health inequities. But with each passing day in this crisis, it's really become clear that many lack this equitable access to the benefits of nature, just as the time when we all really need it most. So, just as systemic racism has impacted the design and distribution of parks and green spaces, the Black and Latinx people in the US are disproportionately dying from COVID 19, and yet another tangible reaction to the true cost of inequitable systems.
Yeah, thank you. So we know there's inequity in access to nature. There doesn't seem to be a systemic approach to making nature happen for families, making it happen equitably. Kim, what does it mean, do you think, to think about nature as part of a broader system or an infrastructure to support community health and well-being, particularly in response to stress and trauma?
Yeah. You know, it's it's like the $1,000,000 question, right? So as we think about how to support communities emerging from this crisis, how can we begin to think holistically about what truly supports health and well-being? I try to think about like a post-COVID world, right? And how can we emerge not having to choose between things like food and shelter or access to nearby nature in order to seek the overall outcomes that so many of the systems in our society are also being created to seek, right? And that's sort of where we are now. That's we sort of have to do this one or instead of one and decision making. There's science behind what I believe, and I imagine that so many of us today on this webinar intuitively understand that spending time in nature makes us feel better. So, what would it mean to think about nature as part of these broader systems? Um, would it mean that all citizens have access to a sense of calm and restoration and measurable reduction in stress? So we know that research has shown that one's mood is enhanced and anxiety and depression is reduced, and that there's improved resilience and the ability to cope with adversity when you actually spend time in nature, like Kathy was saying, with some of those studies. So, can you imagine that all of those challenges that come with dealing with mental illness and the negative behaviors that are often associated with managing stress, sometimes the shame and stigma that's associated with trauma or dealing with traumatic events, um, if access to nature was actually integrated into our larger systems, that energy and the costs, um, where would that where would those now go? What would happen to those particular energies? Perhaps they would start to fade away or at least decrease when nature is a part of our broader systems, supporting the health and well being of our community. And so I think that is ideally the ultimate goal. And can we take advantage of the moment that we're in now to almost hit a pause or a reset button so that when we emerge from this, we can actually start thinking about um, this broader system. I know here in California, when they are closing parks or closing parking lots, for those of us that can walk to nearby nature, we're not impacted by that. But I'm constantly thinking about those that cannot when we make those decisions in this idea of keeping the crowds down. Who are we really impacting, and whose decision is who are we benefiting, honestly, when we make those decisions?
Yeah, thank you. Today we're specifically talking about nature's health benefits. And in order to truly achieve those health benefits that nature can provide, we really need to put racial equity at the center of that movement. And I'm wondering if you could, in my last question to you, talk a little bit about how we might assure equity in such a nature-based infrastructure.
Yeah, when we are specifically talking about the health benefits, that in order to truly achieve health benefits that the connection to nature provides, I think it's imperative that we also talk about racial equity and that we center racial equity in this movement. When racial equity is not centered in our work, we have to also think about the experiences that may result because of racial inequities that also exist or include moments in parks that or moments in nature that may not necessarily equate to the health benefits that we've been talking about. So, for example, for some of us, the idea of rangers or a police presence in a park sort of says, wow, this park feels safe, right? This is a well policed park or staffed park. But for a Black or a Latinx young person, that could be the last place they want to be, right? That their relationship for them and the police may not be something that they want to spend time, a place where they want to spend time. And so therefore, for them, going into that park is going to actually increase their stress, right? And so exactly the reaction that we are not looking to generate. So I think we have to begin thinking about racial equity and speaking about what are those accesses and opportunities and treatments and the statistical outcomes that come with someone's race, and how do we make sure that we incorporate that into this conversation? Because we want to make sure that our framework that we're using tells these are thinking about how is it that racism continues to impact people's access and opportunities and the treatment that they have received when forming their connection to nature. Because being connected to nature is not always about the stress reduction for everyone. And so as long as we're aware of that, as long as we're thinking about that and we're aware of the personal and the familial and the cultural connections that will come from framing this narrative, that will really lead us to an equitable infrastructure that centers nature through culturally relevant ways that I think will then launch us into really thinking about this integrated infrastructure conversation.
Thanks, Kim. I think what I hear you saying is that there needs to be a coordinated effort, sort of a bit of an all hands on deck. We've got sectors from health to mental health, education, urban planning, design, transportation, et cetera, who all have outcomes that they are wanting to achieve through their activities. And we need them all to be thinking about nature as sort of a common pathway to help them reach those goals. But we really need them to be thinking about how to do that in culturally sensitive sorts of ways, because as you said, nature's not necessarily got the same connotation for everyone based on their own personal history, familial history, cultural, ancestral history as well. So thank you for bringing that up. It's a really, really important point. I'd like now to open up for questions and answers. Just a reminder, I hope you've been asking some questions using the audience question function at the top of your screen. And the CNN folks are going to pull some of those questions and begin to place them on the screen, and we'll have a little bit of a moderated conversation here. So the first question from Pamela is, so do you feel that the best thing to do coming out of this pandemic might be in creating policy systems where nature is thought of as an important part of infrastructure, just like water access or utilities? Either of you have a thought about that? Well, I can chime in. I think the answer might be yes. I think that's actually really important to sort of codify this essentialness of nature through policy, and to the degree that policies do help us form infrastructures and implement infrastructures, having nature in there as an essential service, essentially, would be one way of really making it central to a coordinated, what you might call a public health infrastructure. So thanks for that question, Pamela. What do we got next, Laura? Next one is from Nancy Heron. Hi, Nancy. How do researchers, or you, define quality nature and green spaces? Kim, I'm wondering if you might have some ideas about that. You make sure you're off mute.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks.
I think it's really defined by the communities in where the nature and or green spaces are supporting. So it's really not up to me. I think quality, regardless of what it looks like, is going to include well-maintained. It's going to include safe access. It's going to include materials that are not toxic, that are not going to harm, or don't heat up in the summer or under the heat of the sun. That all falls under the umbrella of term quality. But I think when it comes to design or size or types of structures or color, or um, natural versus non, that I think is really very, very personal and community based, and really driven at the local level.
I think that's a really important point about the local level. The need for communities to be involved in the design of their green spaces, I think, is really, really important. But we also know from research that there are some key ingredients to quality nature experiences. We know that the more biodiverse they are, the more likely they are to have the kinds of benefits that we've talked about from the research perspective. Different spaces are better for certain kinds of things. It's helpful to have wide open spaces to do a lot of physical activity and running around, but maybe you need something very different if you're looking for a very calming experience. You need a bench overlooking a stream, or something like that. Little kids might need really nature, naturalized play spaces, nature play. So I think it is important to understand what are the community demographics, what are the ages of the people who come to this park, what are their needs, and combine that with what we know from research. Any thoughts from you, Megan, about if you had to think a little bit about child development and how it might intersect with this question?
Yes, and I'm hopeful that you won't hear my husband in the background talking on his Zoom call. Yeah, I mean, for children, needs these spaces, what is quality for them is a place where they feel like they belong there, and that they are able to muck it up, right? Just sitting there and looking at nature is just not what young children do. They want to get in and poke and touch and taste and explore. So the more you can make it a child-friendly place to engage in exploration and construction and all the other things kids want to do, that's just terrific. But at the same time, you can teach them to respect plants. Like, we're going to construct, but we're not going to pull the plant, right? So they don't have to have complete free reign, but a sense of freedom in the outdoors is really wonderful for kids.
Yeah, that's a really important point. We call that free play in nature. And the more that adults can kind of get out of the way and keep a watchful eye, but stay out of directing the play is really important. Laura, do we have another question? I would love your thoughts on how engaging youth in citizen science during COVID could have positive benefits for them, their communities, and the environment. That's a really interesting question. Kim, I'm wondering, does citizen science come up for you in your organization? No? Okay. I can comment a little bit on that idea of citizen science for those who maybe haven't heard of that concept. It is a sort of participatory approach where people kind of get involved in the research process by doing data collection. They're trained, let's say, to do some data collection. It might be monitoring stream quality or something like that. All sorts of things people can get involved in, just watching and monitoring bird migration, butterfly migration, all of those sorts of things, and contributing that information to science, essentially. And there are a lot of benefits to citizen science for all the parties involved. There's some challenges as well, but certainly it allows researchers to collect massive amounts of information that they couldn't get out there by themselves or with their research assistants all over the country or the planet or whatever to collect this information. So it is of great service to science, but it's also been shown to actually contribute to the learning of folks who are doing it out in the field, whether they're kids or adults or families. And I think part of that certainly comes from learning something about how to do the science. Actually increase your scientific literacy a little bit. You start to understand things about what it means to have reliable and valid data, and how you have to follow procedures and that sort of thing in collecting data. It also engages people in wanting to understand more about the phenomenon that they are helping to study. So it increases scientific curiosity. It gives folks some agency. They're feeling like they are contributing, and they want to do a good job. They want to contribute, that valid and reliable data. It also, of course, is getting people out into nature and observing closely some things that they might not have noticed before. Maybe they're noticing phenology, how the seasons are changing, or how climate is changing what they're looking at. They're more keen observers, and through that, they can develop a stronger connection to nature. So all around, I think citizen science is a really beneficial form of research for researchers, and also for kids and families and individuals who are doing the data collection. So thanks for that question.
A great family activity during this time.
It would be, wouldn't it? Yeah, yeah. We're going to be sending a follow-up email, and there are some great citizen science sites that I can add some links to, and so we'll get some resources out to folks. So the next question from Cass is, the idea of integrating nature into our larger systems to support the health and well-being of communities is so important. With this vision in mind, how do we prioritize nature access in communities facing more immediate issues like homelessness, job insecurity, food insecurity, violence, etc.? Kim, I'm going to ask you to address that one.
Right. And I think this was the conversation around how do we not have to choose one or the other? How is it one and? So none of these should have to be a prioritization. The immediacy of job insecurity, food insecurity, violence are definitely needs, and they're going to be needs. And as we think about nature access in our communities, they're also a need. And as we begin to address the homelessness issue and the job insecurity issue and the food insecurity issue, if there are also opportunities to think about nature access as we're addressing some of these other issues, can we do that at the same time? If there are opportunities to think about readdressing our development policies to include more green spaces, to think about our greenways at the same time, that could in turn address opportunities for more employment opportunities. There are ways to think about how to link these together. Absolutely. The homelessness issue is multi-tiered and multi-layered. And I think that is the danger right now, is that we sort of have this, my issue is bigger than your issue, right? Or my issue deserves more attention than your issue, versus sort of seeing them as holistic conversations. And I think that's where we have to start to pivot now, and to start to think about them not as one or, but one and. Those that are housing challenged are not housing challenged because we don't have parks or because we have too many parks, right? We need to think about the housing challenged and all of the things that they're dealing with. And if we can also think about how can we incorporate more parks and open spaces in communities to help address some of the mental illness challenges that also come with those that don't have access to parks and open spaces. Perhaps those that are housing challenged might not be, because they had the opportunity to de-stress, think about ways of addressing some of their traumatic events that did not involve whatever path they might have taken. So that is exactly the challenge. And we know and we watch cities wrestle all the time. Whose budget gets cut first? Police gets more money, Parks and Recs get less. And that's the conversation that we need to address. And yet, when communities are stressed, when communities need to come together, where do they show up? They show up in parks. So I think that is the ongoing conversation. And it's not about one or, it's really about one and.
Yeah, thanks, Kim. I think one of the important things that you're talking about here is the need for everyone to be using what we call systems thinking. It's sort of like the world is a spider web, and if you pull a thread over here, you're going to jiggle something down here at the other end of the web. And it really shows the interconnectedness of all of these things. If you think about where folks who are experiencing homelessness tend to set up camp, it might be like by a highway, and that is such a environmentally dangerous place for them that would be contributing to physical and mental health issues, as well as stressors. And if we could design, systems to understand how to essentially prioritize access to nearby green space. It doesn't need to be super fancy. Nature is everywhere, but we need to have it in mind. And we particularly, from whatever vantage point we're coming from in our sector, whether we're from health or from urban planning or from education or whatever, thinking broadly about how can we all keep nature top of mind? How can it fit into what my sector is doing, and how my actions in my sector affect other aspects of the world, either for individuals and families or for professionals who are working in other sectors, and really try to come together and collaborate on those things.
Right.
Laura, do we have the next question? This is from Laura Judd. I've heard parents should take care of themselves, and of course we should incorporate nature in our lives in the way that feels best for us as much as possible. What are 3 more action steps that you recommend we do today in terms of promoting resiliency in times of COVID-19? What do you think about that, Megan?
I figured that was coming to me. Well, one of the things that we know is that being grateful is a fabulous stress reducer. I think that sense when we start thinking about the things we have and not the things we've lost is also part of that sense that when we're out in nature looking at the beauty of the world that we've been given, right? So tangibly working on trying to think of 3 things that you're grateful for every day is a wonderful exercise. And of course, if we're thinking of children, maybe doing it together as a family, not at the point where they're going to say, look, I'm grateful for everything but my kid brother, right? But as an actual gratefulness activity. So that is a cost, takes nothing, right? No funds, no having to go anywhere. We know that exercising is probably one of the best stress reducers that you can do. So exercising, especially things that are fun, right? So playing games, running around like you're a little kid again, and playing games with your children is great exercise and would be a big stress reducer as long as everybody's happy. The walks we already talked about, and getting sleep if you can do it. I know that, sleep is one of the first things that we take offline when we're highly stressed because we have to feel safe in order to sleep. But if we can set aside enough time and maybe just exercise yourself to exhaustion so you go into sleep even when you're anxious and worried, but getting that sleep is really important. It cleans up our brain. It literally allows the cleaning crews to go around and clean up the neurons in our heads so that when we get a good night's sleep, you wake up feeling good you've reduced the negative toxic stress chemicals from the brain during that period of time. So sleep, fun play, and running around, and feeling grateful.
One of the things that I've been hearing from my colleagues, particularly those with children, particularly small children, is that they are trying to do it all. You know, they are trying to just be as productive as they were before. They're trying to parent exactly the same way they were before. And what that means is that they end up with a zillion priorities, or really nothing is prioritized. And I've been saying to folks, how about as a family, you just focus on three things? You know, talk as a family about what are the top three priorities for our family right now, and just give yourself some slack and let everything else kind of fade away. I think we need to redefine what success means right now, and success doesn't have to be doing it all. Success can be focused on the things that are most important, and those things might change over time. You might want to check in periodically. Are those still the same three priorities we had as a family last month? Maybe we need to change something up. But I think this is a time to be more narrow, more focused on what really matters. And it's actually a wonderful exercise to think about meaning, something that perhaps we would carry that practice forward even when we're not under social isolation, you know, sort of restrictions.
Emphasizing this with my young faculty who are deeply worried because it's the early part of their careers. And I've, of course, been reminding them that every other young faculty around the country is also not being as productive as they normally would be. So it's going to be okay.
Yeah, we're all in the same boat there, and we're fortunate that those of us who are working and doing that juggling act are actually working. That's a privilege. Laura, do we have another question? This is from Ruth. Can you comment on any research relating to nature and children with autism? So I can talk about that a little bit. Megan, I'm not sure if you've got any knowledge about that specifically, but I do know that while the research is not plentiful in this area, it is emerging, and we are finding that children with autism tend to be calmer outdoors, and they tend to vocalize more. Their language just becomes richer. They become more likely to engage in sort of social communication, and their moods are also better. So while it's not by any means a cure-all for autism, is a complex process, but it's nature is something that can be used for managing well-being in folks with autism, as well as encouraging some aspects of development.
In general,
Megan, are you aware?
Yeah, children with disabilities gain from being in nature like other children. And speaking of equity, we should make sure that, you know, all children get to reap the benefits of being out there in nature and have their moods improve and just feel better.
Yeah, that's an important point. Autism is one of a variety of developmental disabilities that children might experience, some of which create some access issues for them in terms of accessing nature. And that's another one of the things we need to think about when we're thinking about how the systems can kind of come together in a coordinated way and be thinking about equitable access. Equity, you know, is around all sorts of variables. So children with disabilities certainly are a piece of that. Laura, is there another question for us? How can we promote equitable access to nature without contributing to gentrification? Thanks, Anne, for that question. Kim, I'm wondering if you've got some thoughts about this idea. Sometimes we call this green gentrification.
Yeah, the notion of ecogentrification or green gentrification is definitely cities are wrestling with this, and there's this idea sort of just greening something just enough so that it is not it doesn't quite trigger the gentrification of the community around a park that finds itself in the recipient of a capital improvement project. I think what cities are starting to do now is the policies that needs to sort of happen before even the park improvement is to sort of lock in the inability actually to change the housing land around the park where possible. So when the city can purchase the buildings, when the city can purchase the land, when they can put in rent caps around a park, and usually in the parks where we're most worried about gentrification are in communities where it's public housing or the land is mostly owned by the city actually can go in ahead of time and sort of put in the stopgaps to prevent just the type of gentrification that we've watched happen. Usually they don't have the ability to own all the land because there are sort of slices within those communities where the land is privately owned. But they have been able to slow sort of the movement of gentrification, or they have been able to work with the existing homeowners to say, you know, we are going to make sure that the current tax base stays where it is, that you will not be priced out of your home. So there is a real recognition that this has happened. And so now cities, before they have stepped into doing the types of improvements in parks, in communities that absolutely deserve it, there's also the pre-steps that are happening to make sure that those that are living in those communities are not displaced from their homes. They're called equitable development plans. There's one happening in San Francisco right now. Minneapolis has had some success around it. Washington, D.C. So there is some. There are cities that are leading by example to make sure that all citizens have the chance to live around the type of park and green space. Ideally, the way to really get in front of it is that housing prices are not dictated by a beautiful park, that every home has access to a beautiful park or green space, and that housing prices are dictated by something else.
Thank you. Thank you. I think maybe we've got maybe one more question worth of time left. So thanks, Eliza, for this. What about the impact of nature in urban and indoor environments, like with gardening activities? I'm going to put my spin on that. I'm not exactly sure, Eliza, what you're most interested in hearing about, but I think a major point here is that even in urban situations, we can access nature. Some cities are better at that than others, making sort of a green urban environment. But even in the absence of, a really good park system or, nearby nature, we can bring nature indoors. And we can do that through plants and sort of indoor gardening activities, starting seeds and, things like that. Getting ready for planting a vegetable garden, for example. We can also do it to some degree through technology. Being in nature is better, but nature videos, high quality nature videos and images, artwork, things like that can, with some mindfulness practices around them, also evoke some of these, stress buffering responses. So whenever possible, getting outdoors in nature is better. And of course, we talked about there's sort of a gradient. The more biodiversity, the better. But even in our more urban areas, if we really look around, the clouds are there. There are going to be some trees around. There may be dandelions growing in the sidewalk cracks, particularly with young children. Just being mindful of all of those ways that nature sort of presents itself in our built environment is an important way to connect with nature. So we are about out of time. Megan or Kim, do you have any last words, last messages?
I would just echo what you said, Cathy, and say that nature is in us. Nature is everywhere. It's on a windowsill. It is outside of your front door, your back door. It's in a city. It is on a sidewalk. It is not just for those that live in certain zip codes. I think it really is the opportunity to be celebrated everywhere. And I'm thankful that all of you were able to participate today to have this conversation, especially now in this time. If you can't spend the time outside for whatever reason, please bring it inside and reap the benefits as well.
And if you would take a slow walk with a toddler and see the world through their eyes, you will find an immense amount of nature you've been looking right past.
Yes, or stepping on, as the case may be. So I want to thank everyone for being part of this webinar today. Thank you for the work that you're doing to connect children to nature, either in your personal lives or your professional lives. We will be sending out a follow-up email. I know there's been a ton of chatter in the chat box, and you're sharing resources left and right. We will think about what we can put out there in this follow-up email that will be coherent for you. We'll also be taking your suggestions and adding the appropriate resources to findingnature.org. So thank you for all of those contributions. Please stay well, be healthy, and to the extent that you're allowed to give hugs, especially to the children, please hug. Thank you.